Go ahead.
You can go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, beautiful people. So today, before we can actually get into the business of the day, I think it is important that we first start with a reflective review of yesterday's discussions. This will give everyone a chance to share whatever major themes or issues they think came out yesterday, and if you feel like there are things that should be addressed going forward, with the gathering. So we have our co-facilitators sitting amongst you there on the floor, who will be also helping with the discussions, and I think they'll also help with the roving mics. So I think one of the important things that came out yesterday was that not necessarily something that everyone is aware of, but it also came out that perhaps before we share stories of our fellow discussants, we should try and get consent first, so that we don't end up harming people. So I know in some cases we don't mean harm, but consequently that might disadvantage certain people. So before you share anything, please check first if that is okay or that is acceptable. Yep.
Yeah, and I think, good morning, beautiful humans. Another thing that I think we need to talk about and just highlight is we are not oblivious to the current or the recent xenophobic attacks that were happening in South Africa, and we are not turning a blind eye. So at no point do we want anyone to feel unsafe in this space. We are relatively far from circumstances that would harm or be harmful to anyone. But for any reason, should you feel unsafe or feel like your security is in jeopardy, please do talk to us. Otherwise, we are still pushing for a united Africa where everyone has rights. So we did not just want to have this session and ignore the elephant in the room. I hope that is okay. So by all means, should you feel a tiny bit unsettled, please come and whisper in my ear. All right, thank you.
Okay. Today's first item on the agenda is around evolution and progress in politics in Southern Africa. It's going to be done and led by all the facilitators. There's, like I've said before, there's about 14 of us, and then some of them are in the audience. So we're going to be discussing, and at least the first step will be reflection of what had happened yesterday, and then followed by the contextual review. Then from there, we will talk about how to insert whatever we have talked about into the mainstream issues, or at least mainstream struggles, because we are not oblivious that there are multiple struggles that are taking place in the entire African continent. So we're going to be discussing at least on how to insert ourselves in that regard.
Yeah, I think to start off, can we have a reflection of yesterday, just to review discussions that we had yesterday? Volunteers, facilitators, do we have roving mics? Yes, we have the roving mics. So the idea is just to reflect and share with the room conversations that stood out for you, conversations or thoughts that came as a result of the conversations that we had yesterday. Every one of us is welcome to contribute. If you have something that you would want to share from yesterday, but please, by all means, we already have roving mics. To ease you into it, I'll pick on one of the facilitators, and sitting right in front of me is Mpho. So maybe Mpho, can you please share with the room what stood out for you from last night, from yesterday, conversations, just a reflective review on conversations from yesterday.
Should I stand up?
If you so wish, but ideally, yes.
Thank you very much. For me, I was in litigation and strategic communication. And what came out evidently through the discussion was litigation is a very powerful weapon to be used by us as the LGBTIQ community to change the laws and policies in our respective countries. But how do we get to that? By strategically communicating. That is by strategically making groundwork, using the champions such as chiefs also to ensure that people are on board and appreciate the issues. And then when we go to court, it's very easy for us to win, or even if we lose, whatever we are trying to drive, people will be aware of. We use the media and everything. We even made an example that we believe that we somehow failed to take an advantage in Lesotho, whereby one of us wanted a gender mark to be changed on the identification document. And then that person succeeded, but on his own. Had that person taken an opportunity and roped all the community in who had the same issues, it means that all of us would have won. And should I want to have a gender mark being changed, it wouldn't be a hassle, because now the law, or rather there is a case which is being used as a precedent. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have someone else? Yes, Nombulelo, and then the lady just next to Mpho.
Greetings, everybody. Yesterday, I co-facilitated a group which spoke of religion. What we first agreed on is that religion has harmed people, it has hurt and broken people, but it also gave some people some sense of belonging. Then we decided that the church, religion as a whole, not just in Christian, but in general, religious leaders are not so well informed when it comes to LGBTI issues. So us being conforming is also problematic. So the way forward strategically is to be visible in all spaces of religion, be visible, be active, proactive, so to say, and also to educate as much as we can. Somebody even made an example of, instead of buying your religious leader a gift or a suit or a tie, just buy him a book about LGBTI teachings and things like that. It also came that we need to also educate ourselves in understanding ourselves better so that it will be easier to teach others. So information and learning was critical and vital so that we are easily able to educate others who know less, because we cannot be explaining ourselves with facts which are just substantial. Yeah.
Thank you.
Morning, my name is Yvonne Mook. I'm a journalist from Botswana. I was with the mass media group. What really stood out for me was we really have to cultivate relationships, both the media and the LGBTI community, so that we just do away with this cloud of suspicion and this tension that exists between us, so that we tell the stories of the LGBTI persons the way they want them to be told, and then again, so that the community itself doesn't have a sense of entitlement, because we operate with ethics. So what really stood out for me was that we need to have healthy relationships so that we understand each other. And the LGBTI people should also come forth so that they don't fear us. That's what happens a lot, Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, we also we had a hand this side, right? Yeah.
Perhaps before you talk, I need to mention that we always preach LGBTI people having to come forward, but we don't ask ourselves, is the environment conducive and safe enough for them to come forward? So before you can even utter that, first check yourselves if you have allowed them a safe environment to do so. And the responsibility lies with the people who have marginalized and hate the LGBTI people. Because I think somehow you are trying to shift the blame and you're blaming it on them. It's you who don't come forward. But if I come forward, what's there for me? Thank you. No offense, though.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Virginia Makwaza, for those who don't know me. Okay. I think for me, what is important is the sharing of strategies, what has worked and what hasn't worked. And I was in the religion breakaway, and what stood out was the fact that we cannot separate religion and parents, because it is our parents that go to church, it is our parents that want to go to heaven, and and when the pastor says on the pulpit, or the preacher says an LGBTI person is a demon, and a parent is sitting there, knows very well that their child is lesbian or gay or transgender, they become conflicted. And this is the strategy that we've used in the other foundation, that whenever we have meetings with the religious leaders, we bring in parents who will speak to the religious leaders. And that has worked wonders, because with that strategy, we even managed to have the South African Council of Churches adopting a resolution against violence that is perpetuated towards LGBTI people. So let us not undermine our parents. Some of them might not be outspoken about our sexual orientation or gender identity, but if they get into spaces where they are able to speak, and they can speak on our behalf, because it is for us to develop public advocates from our parents and family members who will speak on our behalf.
I think I quite like the idea. So recently in Lesotho, a Minister of Gender had a meeting with the LGBTIQ plus community. And I remember seeing a newspaper headlines, I don't know if my colleagues from Lesotho remember this, that said, gays want... Hannah, what did it say? Yes, so it was a whole newspaper article that said, titled Gays Demand Audience. And I found it to be so misleading, because we had gone all out to invite the media into our space to say, come and report on this monumental movement that is happening. And yet the journalist had the audacity to write a newspaper. And I'm just wondering, from yesterday, particularly my colleagues from Lesotho, I'm going to pick on you. What did you do to redress that situation? Did you ever follow up and try and straighten out that issue? And what from yesterday do you say you have picked up to be able to address such issues should they come? Particularly Shubi, because you are a journalist. Is there something that you can say you picked up that you can take back?
Yeah, Dee is just going through their phone to retrieve. Oh yeah. So basically, what happened was we addressed the issue. This wasn't the first. Let me recap with you guys that. It wasn't the first incident of a media house publicizing our issues the way they feel it's convenient for them. The first incident, we followed up with them demanding an apology. We never got one, but we were able to use a social media platform to advocate for consensus, like consult with us before you publish something that is about us. So this one, Dee can talk more, because Matrix specifically was focusing more on that.
Okay, no, it's all right. We don't even have to dialogue more. I was just hoping that from yesterday and strategic communication sessions, you would have managed to have made links and picked up tactics on how to proceed on this. I understand there's a hand.
There's a hand there.
There, Abo,
On the
yes.
side as well.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Abongile Machila, also one of the co-facilitators for the strategic communication and litigation. And just want to echo some of the points that Paul was making. That a lot of the engagements seem to allude to the idea of community and working alongside each other, with each other, as a good strategy to build messaging and to put a face to what people are saying. So no matter if people accessing court systems, do that in numbers, make alliances, form alliances with other LGBTI groups, and form alliances with law firms, as well as apply for example, friends of courts, to be able to have visibility within the court system as a means of being influential. And the media's role as well in litigation was quite highlighted as strong because the media frames the ways in which the messaging appears in public, and it might inform how the jurisdiction or the lawyers engage that type of messaging to process the court verdict, or to influence the processes forward. So the issue of rights for me was highlighted as well, that in the strategies that seem to work, they opted to use a language that seemed more closer to the community, that seemed to expand the rights to everyone, existing rights that were there. So not necessarily saying that I have the right to sexual education or sexual identity, but saying that we all have a right to, say, dignity, we all have the right to be treated with respect. And so utilizing language that appeals to the people and touches people's hearts seems to be a ways in which you can rope in people strategically to align within your ideals. And litigation seemed to be an end, and it means to say that if there are ways or prospects to engage the law without having to go to the courts to litigate, then we should ought to do so. So I assumed that was really located in advocacy. How far do we go out in our communities to educate the communities about our realities, or create that sense of community, that we are not particularly different or particularly secluded from the needs and the wants of the community, but we are part of them. And so they can also share within the stories and also contribute to framing that stand, or the ones that we want to take as LGBTI people. So yes, I think predominantly I engaged that idea of human rights and thought to myself, a friend of mine, Aus Ellis, I'm not sure if she's in the room now, had mentioned something about how human rights were a good type of framework, but in themselves have their own limitations. For example, in the engagement and founding of human rights, some other human rights at that time were being violated within that engagement of we are trying to put forward human rights. So we really need to find ways to engage people through the principles that they can relate to. So the principle of Ubuntu, for example, as an African value that appeals to the people as opposed to rights, can be something that they were looking forward to. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Clearly, we know that Abongile was taking notes.
Yeah.
And he was listening. Thank you so much, Abu. Unfortunately, we have to swiftly move on to the next part of the session, which we'll still be able to tap on conversations that happened yesterday. But more intentionally, I would want us to reflect on what the context that we find ourselves in right now, where there's progressive politics around us everywhere. And maybe Old Homo, as the gayest of gays that I know, can you just take us through some of the contemporary progressive politics that we are observing, both within the region, continentally, and maybe globally, and just to get us nicely placed so that we can be able to contextualize ourselves?
Okay, thank you very much. Yesterday, when Sebenzile gave us the context of what is going on, Sebe had mentioned also that the rise of political parties, opposition parties rather, has in a way shaped the political environment by providing or at least challenging the powers that be. As we are aware, in Africa, we have had most of the ruling parties have been in power for decades. In my country, Botswana, ever since independence, 1966, we have had the same political party in power. In South Africa, ANC has been in the same position, and then you name it. I mean, this is why it's easy for most of us to know how many presidents we've had. My lifetime in Botswana, we've only had 4 presidents. Zimbabwe has only had 2 presidents. So, I mean, this just gives you the context of what is going on. But also, in addition to that, we have one of the political matters, things that happened in Botswana, just a couple of years, not in Botswana, rather, in the Southern African, just a couple of years ago, I think some of you are aware that SADC used to have a SADC tribunal, which was shut down because of the powers that be. I think some of you know where the problems with SADC tribunal started, who championed the closure of SADC tribunal. So which meant that when we weigh things, there is the African court that has certain people, certain countries have subscribed to the African court. There was a SADC tribunal. So those people who in the Southern African continent, Southern African region, who do not subscribe to the African court means that if you have exhausted all the court systems in your country and do not subscribe to the African court, it means basically you have no way of going in the African continent. All that will be left is the international court. So hence why maybe perhaps we need to see what can be done with the SADC to save it. One of the things that we have seen in South Africa, for example, I think South Africa is the only country that has equality court, where you can take matters concerning human rights. In some of the countries, like my country, we don't have equality courts. Most countries just have your customary courts, your magistrate courts, your high courts, and supreme courts, and that's it. So perhaps in a way, when we talk about the political context of these countries, we need to also see that it is the politicians that shape up the other arm of the government, which is the judiciary. So we need to also, because the judiciary, its intention, its mandate is to keep in check the executive arm as well as the legislative arm. So if all these 3 pillars don't work hand in hand, if all these 3 pillars are not independent of each other and not strong enough to challenge each other, then we have a problem. I mean, I suppose I could be saying, I can show off and say I'm from Botswana, where all these 3 arms work independently and are free to challenge each other. We have, now I can see my own handwriting. We have the rise of national human rights institutions. Most of these have been initiated at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Some of them came up as recommendations from the Universal Periodic Review. I'll keep giving examples of my country, Botswana, where many countries, for many years, countries have been recommending. Of course, these recommendations came because of civil societies in Botswana were asking other states to make these recommendations to our government for the establishment of the national human rights institutions. These national human rights institutions their mandate will be to keep the government in check in terms of human rights. So that means that if all of our countries in the Southern African continent or the African continent at large have independent national human rights institutions which are based on the Paris Principles. Paris Principles meaning that all of these institutions must be independent from the 3 arms of government. All of these institutions must have the powers to take to task anybody, including the government, including organizations or whatsoever, these institutions will have the power to train or to teach people about their rights. And these institutions,
No, I want you to finish. I just wanted to highlight that I have a question on that. Yeah.
okay. Now you made me forget.
Ish.
So,
You really are aging. I'm sorry, my friend.
go ahead and ask.
Ageism on stage.
It's not ageism. Him and I play like that, and it's okay to age. Yes. I think the question that I wanted to pose and maybe to come on to Brian
Don't pose a
is,
question. Let me share my views.
Yeah.
yes, you will share. I'm just
Don't
giving a
put me
bit
on
of
the spot.
context. What I wanted to share is, as I might get struck off for this, but as a human rights lawyer, I'm always conflicted because if you look at the formations of human rights, the question is, do we truly believe it's the only tool that we can use? And at its formation, were human rights inclusive of LGBTI rights, or are they inclusive enough? If so, can we say that at the founding of Eleanor Roosevelt's conceptualization of human dignity, are we saying that they were inclusive enough for us to read into them LGBTI rights? And if so, what are we saying about the struggles and progressively countries realizing that maybe this is not sufficient?
Okay.
Yes. To what point can we say there is a progression in politics of unpacking, politics of questioning, politics of challenging?
Okay, so I think human rights are a good framework that we can use. But I think the flaw about our current human rights perspectives is that they tend to put certain bodies or experiences in a hegemonic position.
Yes.
So we know we have human rights, but are they, like Steve's mentioned yesterday, how is this all, conceptualized?
Yes.
Does it include all people in society, or does it favor certain people over others?
Yes.
I mean, the fact that we're all here means that we are fighting a common cause, right? We are gathered here because we want to see social change. We know we've got social problems in our respective countries and in our societies. I mean, there's no society that is not faced, with social problems. And we know the one that brought us here together is the social problem of, the criminalization or disregard of LGBTI human rights.
Yeah.
And the common idea is that something needs to happen. We need to do something to change this social problem. But the issue is with social change, not all segments of society. I mean, in South Africa, we know LGBTI rights, are recognized by the Constitution. But there are certain segments in society, in their rebellion and resistance, portray acts of hate crimes where some people are killed, lesbian women are killed or raped because a man somewhere believes that his penis has power to change this woman. And also, when we have LGBTI people in certain spaces whereby they can, influence or guide change, they also tend to create certain hegemonies. Like, the gays, we are always at the forefront and creating this image that we are the only ones or we are the mostly affected. I won't even talk about trans people because we overtook the movement, their struggles, and after receiving our gains, we shut them out.
Yes, I like that you're taking it there because I wanted to say, even with the progression that we're making, are we aware that the all that we are talking about is not necessarily all? Because when you look at the organizing within the lesbian movement, the trans movement, it's lacking behind. And if truly, truly we want to talk about the intersectionality that I am
I have an issue with
with.
intersectionality. It's like a buzzword, but in reality, we don't see it happening.
Yes. So now my question is, how then, linking us to the third segment of the conversation, how then do we create an environment conducive for the all to be truly all? And what other progressive movements can we ride on? And a specific example would be gender-based violence and femicides. If you look at the way cis women have carried this struggle, it's very heteronormative. It's as if they are the only persons that are at risk.
Targeted, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah,
Such
yeah.
that even when you look at the recently I was watching TV and I saw the list. The list assumed that all the women
I had sure.
are hetero women, and the
Hetero,
question is,
yeah.
are we visible enough? Are we doing enough to assert? Are we keeping sufficient records? So how do we then mileage on this progressive movement? Because it's happening.
So, with social change has to go hand in hand with progressive politics.
Yes.
So you can't preach and work towards social change if the politics of the country or your respective environment are not aligned with that. So we know in South Africa there's been so much progress. Our politics are progressive. To a point where South Africans feel like they are superior to other African countries. But despite having achieved a certain aspect of social change, there are certain elements which still exist. It's the same with apartheid. We know it has ended, but elements of racism still exist. So as the LGBTI community can say we've got laws, right? So why should we still continue with the struggle?
Yeah.
But the reality is that on the ground, the effects are still there.
So I don't know, maybe we should put it to the floor. The question would be, how do we mileage on current progressive politics to leverage the storm with which they're coming to insert the LGBTI agenda and to ensure that it is an inclusive one, not just a one-sided stream?
I also have an idea.
Yeah.
I think that another issue is that we preach LGBTI.
Wait, Bongani,
Wait.
The audience is itching to
Yeah,
chip into that.
we will give the audience a chance. So
No.
No, he hasn't. He's coming. So whenever people are invited to present on LGBTI issues, you'll have a gay person, right? Speaking on behalf of everyone.
Do you
And-
see what is happening here on the panel?
Our issues, no, listen. We can deny this as much as we want, but our issues are different. We are faced with different struggles. As a gay man, my challenges are not the same as a trans person. So by putting me in certain spaces means I'll amplify my issues. And pardon? Oh, okay. I apologize for that.
Yes, I really think we should give it to the floor, because even within the movement, we need to acknowledge we have borrowed all these hetero habits,
Yep.
whereby you see, and I'm sorry to say this if it's going to sound offensive, but I don't think it should be offensive because it's the truth, where you see the gay movement overtaking every conversation. And because in as much as we would want to say we are on an equal footing, there is a disempowering factor to being born in a vaginal body, particularly in patriarchal Africa, where a woman is a perpetual minor. So I think as we have these conversations, we need to be cognizant of certain issues that are intrinsic and to start having frank conversations of how do we exist in this climate, all right? So yes, I'm going to use my authority. It's onto the floor. Liberty, I saw your hand, love.
It was just a comment with regards to Kane having spoken, and then you asked the question, and then we never got to hear Kane finish his presentation. So it was just a question around that particular process.
Okay. Oh.
So, I'll chip in after the audience. Yeah.
I think from my end, definitely sharing, thank you for the wonderful conversation and presentation around how we've moved from our pasts to where we are currently pertaining human rights realizations and the evolution of our progressive politics, but perhaps also recognizing that even before the conceptualization and implementation of these human rights institutions, and before it became somewhat popular in certain contexts to focus on LGBTI or queer politics, there were already movements across our continent that were doing the work in being able to try and affect change in one way or another. I think one of the examples would be that Gender Dynamics is not the oldest trans organization on the African continent, but there, in West Africa, there was trans organizing that tried to affect change in their particular way. In terms of looking at how, and I'm going to use South Africa as a case study in terms of how we incorporated sexual orientation as one of the grounds not to be discriminated against in our constitution, but also how that never translated really into affecting change for everyone in the community. That after 1994, what we've seen is this conflation between sexual orientation and gender identity, and that gay identifying individuals took the lead in what the rights discourse would look like, so much so that the transgender was put on the back burner. And now we need to try and find ways of how we can work towards a human rights focused way of understanding what, for example, legal gender recognition looks like. It's currently very pathologized in one way or another in our law. So in looking at where we come from and where we are going, there's this assumption that we are one monolithic group, but it's not true. We have different interests, and in many instances, those interests are overlooked by who the dominant persons in the conversations are. If we look at even strategic opportunities that we are trying to utilize throughout the history of our politics in being able to insert ourselves within the discourse of gender-based violence and femicide, it's been very difficult because of the assumptions made around it, even up until today. And this is the South African context, so I cannot imagine what might be happening in other contexts and how constrained those environments might be. But how there is this overemphasis on cis-normativity. Even in this very space, what we are talking about is still cis-normativity. We're talking about gender-neutral bathrooms that's on the second floor, the first floor, then we have not done enough to be able to shift the status quo. We must ask ourselves the question around why then here, where we know that certain bodies will be relegated to the margins on the second floor, when we try to live our identities in this space, it's very superficial because bodies use toilets all of the time, right? Yeah. And so it's gender non-conforming bodies, we don't ask for consent to go into spaces, we just go into it and it becomes a problem. So how do we hold that problem then? And it's not a problem for us, it's a problem for the venue in itself in being able to grapple with that. But in terms of coming back to how we conceptualize it, definitely also looking at how we then, in moving forward, try to link our past to our current context and future to what has happened in the past to correct what has happened in the past. So there is also increased emphasis placed on trans and intersex organizing within our communities. We will never see the change if we are not going to be intentional about how we increase the capacity of organizations to be able to do the work, both led by the community, but also organizations that are allies to the community, so that we can then influence the progressive politic as we want to know it, because that needs to happen on our terms.
Yeah, thank you so much, Liba. I was actually waiting for someone to ask the question. Okay, we have Virginia.
First, and then Mabatu.
And then Mabatu.
Okay, so I want to tell a very short story. So I was in this protest in Johannesburg in town. We were protesting against the African National Congress, which was quiet after the many killings of the lesbian women in South Africa, in Johannesburg specifically. So they actually put us away, the police put us away from the office itself of the National African National Congress. I don't even know how to pronounce it. And then this police officer who knows me, he calls me because I said, we are going to move from here, whether they want it or they don't, and go right in front of the office of the National Congress. And then he calls me and says, Sisi, we don't want to arrest you. And I'm just wondering, what actually are you fighting for? Because you are in all these marches. When people are marching over the land, you are there. When people are marching on environment, you are there. When people are marching against xenophobia, you are there. Now is Itabane, you are here. What exactly are you looking for? And that for me showed that I am actually an intersectional person in terms of struggles. And I think it is high time as LGBTI people to insert our struggle of LGBT within the struggles that affect everyone. Because besides being a lesbian, I'm also a woman, I'm also a mother, I'm also a citizen that pays tax, I drive on the roads that have potholes, so we need to be there. In most cases, we always say we are not given an opportunity. How do we insert ourselves is an important question. How do we take our struggles of LGBTI people into the struggles where people are saying we want a feminist government? How do we take ourselves into struggles about climate issues, about environment, taking care of the environment? And it starts with us. Yesterday, I was so disappointed to see the peels of candy on the floor. That means we don't care about the environment that carries us. So it is important that we are aware of all the struggles and all the initiatives that are happening around us, so that whether they like it or not, we are there. We once went as LGBTI people into the COP17 march, and some of them women were saying, but this is not the struggle of is Durban. But we showed them that this Durban are also affected by climate change, and that's why we are here. And I think that is very important for me. Let us be visible everywhere.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Mabatu?
Good morning, Dumela.
Dumela, ma.
Before I make my point, I wanted to highlight something that hasn't been highlighted so far, which I think is quite odd. This week is International Bi-Visibility Week, and it's aimed at highlighting and affirming the experiences of bisexual people internationally. We're at a regional kopano, and I'm seeing the invisibility, I guess, happen by not stating it's a week. And I would just like to affirm myself and other bisexual people in the room that you are here, you are visible. Thank you. And on the note of inserting ourselves in spaces, I see myself as a development practitioner. So I do work on the lens on African development, and I work within spaces of social entrepreneurship, the environment, climate change, queer issues, feminism, and economic inclusion, and all that. But my gripe isn't necessarily with us inserting ourselves. I think we do a lot of work in showing up and being visible, but we haven't necessarily mitigated erasure. And how do we respond to how can we mitigate when we're being erased by people who we assume we're in the same struggle with? Let me give an example of, actually, even within the room, for example, we have different kinds of feminisms, right? Mm-hmm. And there's queer feminism, and everybody understands feminisms, but there are also trans-exclusionary feminists.
Yes.
They can probably be within the space as well.
Yeah.
But somehow are holding space instead of mitigating. Why would you pride yourself in such violence within your own people?
Yeah.
And why do you not see them as your own people? Yeah. You understand? So I think that the major issue is that when we are erased by others, when you invite, for example, you invite media to come to your space and then they write something violent, what atonement comes from media? What apology comes from media? Within this own space, when somebody says something problematic on stage and we call them out for that, how is there no apology and atonement from that? When erasure happens, how do we mitigate it? And I think that's the bigger conversation that we need to have, and not necessarily showing up in spaces, because people have showed up so much so that we find ourselves having privileges we don't even know, we don't even see that we have. For example, wearing a bikini on the beach has a lot to do with what happened in the 1900s in the US. So we need to really mitigate how we can work towards being erased and countering erasure.
Okay. I want to add something just before the powerful lesbian in Namibia takes over.
My question is linked to the sisters one.
Okay.
There's the politics that we don't discuss in this space, and it's the our own heterosexual people in our own movement. Because most of our work is very external and very labeling of the external heterosexuals. But we
Yeah.
forget that in the LGBT acronym itself, there are people who identify as heterosexuals. So how do we deal with those politics within this own? Virginia has just put me on the spot. Now she's triggering a lot of buttons inside me. I'll start. So, it's imperative for us to reflect on the soggy S concept itself.
Yes.
It's imperative for us to also reflect on the LGBT acronym itself.
Yeah.
Because we haven't done our work yet there. We've climbed ourselves and we keep marching and we keep fighting in spaces like this. That's the first entry. So when we talk about heterosexual, if you unpack, this is not a homosexual movement. The only two homosexuals here, that's the gays and lesbians. The rest have other identities,
Yeah.
other sexual orientations, and we don't discuss that. The bisexuals have spoken for themselves. I won't even touch your agenda. So can the trans people speak in this room? Because there are heterosexuals and homosexuals in that community.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hence I
And
said,
what we deal with in this room is about their identities and how they look.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, when it gets dark and we go and exchange fluids, those things are completely different. And I think those are discussions that we need to unpack.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think.
Wait.
Okay.
Wait. Yes. Wait. Triple H, sit down first. Sit down first. We'll come back to you.
No.
Can we have order, please? Yeah, we'll come back to you, Triple H. Yes, what I wanted to add earlier, then some of you will come and comment on Linda's input. So I know some of you are itching to input on that in that regard. What I wanted to add earlier was that, especially to give examples from my own country as Botswana, it's like how to insert ourselves into the mainstream agendas. Yesterday, one of the speakers mentioned unions. For us, working with unions has been very instrumental because it gave birth to one of the most progressive political or legal instruments in Botswana, which is the Employment Act. And these are the kind of statutes that we used to end up gaining ground in terms of decriminalization. What we did, we understood that LGBTI individuals are workers. So just the same way that unions represent workers, we went to unions and say, we have LGBTI individuals who are workers, who belong to your unions, but they are being laid out because of who they are. How are you going to help them? So when the 2009 Employment Act was being structured and everything was being done in 2009, the end result of that was that HIV was included as one of the grounds that you cannot terminate somebody's employment on, and then explicitly sexual orientation was listed as such. But unfortunately, we don't have gender identity. That means it's the next fight for us that we need to do. Another things that we need to insert ourselves in, we need to understand that we are in Africa. And I know we usually fight and say there's no such thing as African culture. But this time I'm just going to be ignorant and use that term. We understand that African culture, we have customary setups where we have kotlas. In Botswana, we call them kotlas, where we meet in the villages with the chiefs and other people. Every village has certain committees. In Botswana, we call them village development committees. Those committees know everything about the village. Those committees are responsible to organize and prepare the village when legislators come in. And those legislators are the ones who are going to take agendas to parliament. So for us to insert ourselves into the minds of those political leaders, we need to insert ourselves in the minds of those village development committee members, because they are the ones who are going to be engaging with the legislators. The other group, Virginia rightfully said, mentioned parents and religion, but the other group, how we work in Botswana, we use PIF, like parents, friends, and families of the LGBTI. We are aware that most of you here, the young generation especially, well, most of us here are working class. Between 8 and 5, you're at work. Absolutely no employer will give you time off to go and listen to your legislator who has come to your constituency. So, but our parents who are not working have that time to go and listen to the legislator. So what we have done in Botswana was to teach, or at least make our parents aware of human rights and also train them to be our advocates where we are not available, so that they are able to challenge the legislators and say to the legislators, my child is transgender, but she or he is having these problems in the village. How are you going to help my child? My child is lesbian, my child is this. And then the thing is that in African culture, your voice as a young person takes backseat to the voice of an elder, whether we like it or not. So when a parent is challenging the legislator, they are bound to listen more than they can listen to you as a young person. And then the other one was around constitutional changes in the country. Mostly we are told that the constitution is a hard thing to change. I suppose it's cast in stone. So usually we target small laws, like I've mentioned, your Employment Act, among other things. And then there are laws like your Children's Act. There are incidences where, like in Botswana, I think 2 years ago, we had a case where a trans-identifying student was refused to write examinations because the child identified as a trans woman, as a trans girl. And then the school was like, okay, we can't allow you to come in dressed the way you are, which goes against the Children's Act. So we had to show to the school that the Children's Act, everything says everybody has a right to education. What you are doing means that you are basically saying to that child, you don't belong here. You are in a way infringing on that child's right to education. Okay, the others I can't see my own handwriting. So.
It's okay.
You're done.
I think also I just want to challenge us to say, in most instances, we are talking about jurisdictions or countries where the situation is liberal enough to allow visibility. What about in countries where visibility could cost lives? What about instances where that visibility comes at a cost? Maybe not your life. I know in Lesotho they'll target you and you'll not be employable. And sometimes people have to choose between, do I want to really pursue this or do I need to leave? And there's no point. Steve Bantubiko, whom I love with all my heart, says, there's no pride when you're dead. So the question would be, what are we saying in those jurisdictions or in those spaces where just to want to assert space is harmful to you? What kind of tips, what kind of conversations can we have? Are we ready to stand in solidarity? And this is a critical question as people within the SADC region, because I see it all the time. There'll be a post about how Black Coffee has bought a new, what do you call it? What is it? Was it an aeroplane? Jet. I don't even know what that thing is called because I can never have it. It was everywhere. We were sharing it in thousands, right? But the moment there's a story of a trans woman that was killed in Zimbabwe, of a gay person that was harmed in Malawi, of movements in Lesotho being prohibited from voicing out, you are not there for solidarity. So what is the point? What are we saying? Is it possible for the movement to organize itself such that where visibility is harmful, can we rely on you to be our mouthpieces? Is there such a space? Are we ready to have such conversations among ourselves, among peers, or in a big group?
So I think it speaks to the whole idea. We assume that, within the acronym, all our issues are the same. I think that's the biggest problem and the biggest downfall. Because in working collectively as the LGBTI community, we are amplifying a certain issue or a certain group. And I think that's something we have never taken a critical look at. which has been happening all along. Because in my society, when they talk about a gay person, they speak about trans women, right? So, which means previously, when people were targeting gay issues, they were targeting trans issues, right? And which means trans have always been on the forefront and visible. But the gays, with their privilege, took over. I'm not saying visible in acceptable terms, like not that they were accepted, but their issues have always been public, right? But we took over, right? And said, no, and then the government said, okay, fine, same-sex marriages are legalized. We didn't think of continuing with the struggle to say, oh no, make healthcare or gender reassignment surgeries accessible to transgender people. We didn't even think about that. We are there, we can get married and all of that, but we didn't think about other bodies or other struggles within the LGBTI movement. But also to speak to what Virginia says about intersectionalities. I mean, in Africa currently, decolonization is a big word. How do we locate ourselves within the decolonization project? Because most of our issues come from colonization.
Yeah.
We know we had African sexualities. Kane, there is African culture. The issue is that today it's not defined by Africans. We have elements of colonization in African culture.
Yeah.
And then we have embraced that as African.
Yeah.
All these penal laws against LGBTI people are colonial effects. So how do we then speak to our policymakers and say, no, listen, when we speak of decolonization, also look into these issues, our issues, because we don't exist, in a vacuum of some sort. We are citizens. We are equally affected by all the issues, even though there's a narrative that is pushed that suggests that we are not equally, affected.
I hear you and I agree with you, but I'll keep referring to oppressive regimes and passively aggressive regimes like the government of Lesotho.
But decolonization is across.
Yes.
So
What I'm
then
trying to say to you is we recently codified the penal laws in Lesotho.
Of course.
Meaning it remains a crime.
Yes.
You understand? So my question is, are we cognizant of the fact that sometimes for us to want to elevate places us at more harm and risk? You understand? But I'm very interested to hear what the Reverend wanted to say, because I feel like we need intervention beyond humanly capacity. Reverend?
Hello, everyone. I'm Judy Macaulay. Thank you. It's good to be here. It's my first kopano. I was so looking forward to be here. But sorry I'm late by one day. I'm hearing about the good things yesterday. I think what I want to add to this conversation so far is actually the importance of intersectionality. I think it's very important. I myself is actually an embodiment of intersectionality. And I think that the reality. And sometimes when we march forward, we also sometimes have to look behind us, how far we've come and how further we want to go. I'm not going to embarrass people because I can mention so many names in this space. But Linda is also somebody that's actually fine-tuned me, my good friend from Namibia. But I think that the other thing is that, there is a relationship between politics and religion. We know that many of our parliamentarians will speak from the angle of their own religious beliefs, particularly when it comes to the human rights for the LGBT community. And I think this is also an area where we as people need to get ourselves into politics. We need to get ourselves into constituency where we'll be voted in as representative of members of parliament so that we can speak the language that we understand for our own community. I'm not into politics at the moment, but I am hoping to become a priest in the Anglican Church. Now, for the last 6 years, my ordination to priesthood has been stalled because of my voice. I speak openly about the importance of same-sex marriage. I speak openly about the fact that, people living with HIV should have the rights, to baptism, to confirmation, to ordination. And a lot of these things have been, denied or objected by the church. So, of course, they're holding me back somewhere. But I know that there's a greater power that will move us forward. But I also want to emphasize, I know many of us might have heard the phrase, nothing about us without us. But I think it's important that we get ourselves, not just at the grassroots level, but right to the very top, of the positioning and decision making. But I also want to make one quick observation. honestly. It was March 2009, and this was in London, where I live. Another activist, stood up at a program and said, Reverend Judy Macaulay is a disgrace, is an embarrassment. And he says, simply because he embraces the colonizer's religion. My heart sunk. Simply because I live in London, I had to face racism. Is in London is the first time I knew I was a black person. I faced xenophobia, I faced homophobia. Then to now face what I consider Christophobia was something below the belt. But I think that we need to understand one another. I am a Christian, and I'm also one of those people that embrace all forms of religion and respect it very well. But we need to work together because for me as a Christian, there's something very fundamental about the inclusivity. Until we change the minds of people, we can't change, until we change our own minds, we can't change the minds of others. And I think one of the things that we've done over the last few years, we worked on a project called Destabilizing Heteronormativity. Some of you might have heard about it. It's really to get people to change their minds and understand the theology. And moving forward, and there's the last thing I'll say, is that we want to develop an African queer theology that also looks at what is the position of LGBTQ people, or whatever phrase you want to call it, prior to colonialism, prior to the missionaries coming here, and what are the benefits of the missionaries and the religion that we embrace today. And I want to say thank you so much to all of you and for the work you do. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Reverend.
I want to
Liberty had something to say.
perhaps touch in on what Linda earlier said around trans voices being so quiet in the room, and also bring us back to the history of why many of our organizations moved out of LGBTIQ organizations to organize and be able to tell our own stories and represent ourselves within our own capacities. So also perhaps urging us to tell the histories of where we are also coming from. And I see one hand going up. And perhaps tying into the whole idea of human rights language and also the possibilities that came with it, but also the challenges that came with it. Yesterday we spoke about how limiting it becomes when we have to engage our communities. The work that we need to have done is also work around shifting hearts and minds of people to be able to see the humanity in others without having to devalue that in one way because of that characteristic. And I think perhaps when we go and we engage in intersectional ways, perhaps also steering away from using human rights centered language, and perhaps more language focused on values and principles that holds our communities together. And perhaps that also ties into that decolonial way of doing that we are being deprived of in one way or another, and then packaging that information. And yeah, in terms of just again emphasizing the need for us to speak up, because our histories are distinctly different from a trans and gender diverse perspective. And perhaps therein lies the possibility for how we reconceptualize how bodies ought to be engaged with. Constantly there's an emphasis around heteronormativity. And you don't hear cis-normativity because most of us identify, or most people in this room perhaps identify as being heteronormative, and that is telling around how we have been silenced and invisibilized within this movement and within the spaces in which we exist on this continent. So let us use this opportunity to tell our stories and tell our stories from our perspectives.
Can I just ask quickly, Liberty, do you think it would help for us to have a side organization around the issue of how we see us, how we want to be seen, and how we want to facilitate this being seen and seeing ourselves? Because I feel like it is in moments like this when great epiphanies have to happen. Otherwise, it would have been a waste of time if we were here and we come back with the knowledge that we had. So is it something that people would have an appetite of? Because I feel like if not now, when? If not us, then who?
It is a sad, if that is going to be the case, it's going to be a very sad reality of where we are at, and we need to hold that people, there are certain people in the space that are more marginalized than others in many regards. And we must also then ask ourselves, what do we mean when we say safe space? What do we mean when we talk about telling stories on our own terms and feeling protected within this particular space by our siblings? Looking back and also at another gathering of stakeholders from across the world, the LPQ Women's Conference that took place in June in Cape Town, and also an illusion being created that it is a safe space for trans and gender diverse persons. And we had to convene on the margins of the space, but there was an assumption already going into that particular space that there was going to be trans exclusionary radical feminists that is going to have a particular agenda, making it unsafe for us. I don't think that from where I am sitting, that was the assumption that I came into this space with, when we have a regional conversation around LGBTI politics and how we move forward and how we look to our past to be able to get guidance on how we move forward. So that it would be very much an open space, but perhaps there is a need for that.
Okay, thank you very much. I saw Fikile and then Deonce and then Neville and then Mamuch, I think Sebenzile.
Thank you very much.
If we keep it to 2 minutes each, Sebenzile will still be able to go.
2 minutes is a
Okay,
lot.
1 minute. 1 minute.
One
fix.
minute even. All right. Ngiyathokoza bandla kubogogo nabomkhulu namakhehla.
Thokoza, mama.
I just wanted to share an anecdote, right, in terms of progressive ways of organizing in hostile environments, in terms of how we have done it over years. So for example, I think I'm just adding, and I'll be brief. What we did in South Africa, for example, we worked with organizations like HURISA, the Human Rights Institute of Southern Africa, because we recognized that sometimes not all of us can take the forefront, but we need allies. We need to recognize organizations who have that voice already, who are willing to insert. So we needed to change mindsets. But we also recognize the fact that we are sex workers as well. Right? So we cannot just frame ourselves just as LGBTI, which is why we started working with organizations like SWEAT, and then ASWA was born out of that, the African Sex Workers Alliance. So within the HIV/AIDS movement as well, with the Treatment Action Campaign. And when we started doing those movements, we realized that actually most of these movements are led by people who actually identify as either lesbian or gay or trans or intersex even. So it even made it easier that the leadership of the other movements were actually people who understood who we are as identifying as LGBTI people. In Uganda, we did the same thing. How do you organize when you know you are going to be killed? So we had to speak to Akina Mama wa Africa, for example, organizations like that. We had to speak to lawyers, progressive lawyers in Kenya, so that people like Muthoni and many others who would be able and be willing to take up the struggles. We did the same in Lesotho, in many parts, in Botswana. I remember the days when Lekhabibo could not even exist. Ditshwanelo was an entry point. There are many conversations that we had with organizations like Ditshwanelo to make it happen. And people opened doors. And it was not easy conversations because the human rights framework in itself, like we already have been saying, has got its own limitations and its own challenges. But what was important to realize was that at least it is an entry point. So we need allies. We also utilized the unions. We had to work with COSATU. We had to go to COSATU. COSATU has a gender policy and say, what are you doing with your gender policy? We also needed to have friends in parliament. Parliamentary committees were spaces where we just needed our friends and people we can trust. People that we drink coffees with in the kitchen to say, when you are in that committee, please stand for our struggles because we can't do it on our own. So those kinds of things and the intersections continue to work. And it was important that we don't just ask people to represent our own struggles, but that we also buy into other people's struggles. Yeah. So when we march for HIV, when we march for housing, when we march for land, our faces had to be in the forefront as well. Because we're not going to be killed for marching for land, because you're not written lesbian, you're not written gay on your face, right? So you are going to be seen. And somebody whose really problem and issue is a lack of house at that time, next time when it is your issue, they will come in the forefront. So over time, those struggles have worked. And I think that for me, the answer still relies on, still remains intersections of
Thank you so much, Fix.
Yeah.
Thokoza Gogo. We had Mamokwe this side.
Morning.
Great, okay.
My words have really been taken by you. So, but thank you. In terms of answering your specific question about how to deal with, about how to deal with being visible if it comes at a cost. And I was just going to talk very briefly about what we did in Botswana in 1 minute. I think the role of allies is incredibly important, but so is research. Research, we've been talking about decolonization. What do we actually mean? It sounds really nice, but what does it mean? And what of that colonization are we happy to keep? And what are we happy to dispense with? It's important to know ourselves, to know who we are, and to be aware about our cultural context, our socio-political, economic context in which we operate. The allies one can find in the religious spaces, in the political spaces, but also in the NGO spaces. But you also find adversaries in the NGO spaces. And that's what we found when we started to work on, in those days, it was just lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. And we were often opposed by friends of ours, by sisters of ours. The women's movement refused to deal with lesbian issues. People would always be sent to, oh, go to the Tshwanelo. They deal with everything. You know, we're dealing with women's issues, you go to the Tshwanelo. And what's important for allies is to remember that ultimately our role is one of accompaniment and support. It's not to take over the struggles of other people. It's also important that allies should be regularly informed and educated because we don't know everything. I get confused at times, but I ask questions. For example, terms like cis, intersex, trans, these are words and descriptors which I was not aware of in the past, but because I feel safe, I'm able to display my ignorance, and through that way, I learn. Mandate-based activity and activism and advocacy is incredibly important. Allies should not forget that one needs to work on the basis of mandate of those on whose behalf one is advocating. For a long time, I became the face of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals in Botswana. I ended up attending meetings, and people would sometimes ask me, so why are you carrying the candle for gays and lesbians, expecting me to go to some huge confessional, to go and tell them, but I said, because I believe ultimately that every single person should be able to live their lives with dignity, regardless of your color, of your age, of your sexual orientation or gender identity, or ability or disability. And so ultimately, I think it might be useful to have a group for allies, if it's possible. You talked about self-organized group. For us to try and find out and share our experiences, identify challenges, and how we can truly be of support and walk the journey with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I also had Neville. Dionse and then Neville.
Hi. I'm claiming my autonomy and I'm sitting down. I will not stand. And so now we're talking about progressive spaces in the name of intersectionality. And I'm finding intersectionality a very violent space. Because I'm sitting in a space that is supposed to be intersectional and in a space that is supposed to be safe. But as a trans person, I'm feeling traumatized every time somebody opens their mouth. Because we're looking at our history and our heritage and we are reclaiming, and it is still same sex. And it is not recognizing gender identity. The vaginas movement, which are the feminists and the lesbians, have told me as a trans woman, I'm never woman enough because I do not possess a vagina. And now in the name of intersectionality, they want to work with me. And they are not taking time to understand the issues and sensitize themselves before welcoming me into the space and therefore being violent. The gay men's movement has forever been exclusionary of trans men and have blatantly in movement meetings told trans men, vaginas cannot tell me about being gay. And now in the name of intersectionality, you want to work with me. The gender-based violence movement has been exclusionary of me for years and now wants to work with me in the name of intersection and still not understanding my issue and the plight I face. My sisters have been dying for years. They have been slaughtered and brutalized for years, and no candle was lit and no hashtag was created. And now we must all celebrate out here. And cis homosexuals, in the name of gender nonconformity, shall occupy spaces where trans persons should be sitting. So can we have that conversation around identity versus expression? Because you are gender nonconforming in expression and not in identity. So do not take my seat at the table, because you are disadvantaging me in an era where you say intersectionality and you do not. We are over-mentored as trans people. We are not given that. We are told we are included, but it is tokenistic because we've been sitting in these spaces for years. We have 3 lead facilitators. Is there a trans identity sitting up there? Is there a self-identifying trans identity that can claim their space up there? The space is organized in such a way where the attendance register still has my dead name attached to and outing me. And this is supposed to be a safe space. And when we're talking about politics and access, I'm being told, speak about the issue and forget your identity, when my identity is the very reason I've been excluded. And so when we're speaking about safe spaces and how to deal with trauma when we are organizing in this progressive space, well-being and trauma, for those of us that sit in the spaces, that find spaces very unsafe, because I'm feeling traumatized in my whole being as I sit in the space. Pronouns are used, conversations are happening. We are saying transgender and we say she and he, and we forget that transgender is a diverse spectrum. We don't only exist in masculinity and femininity. You are again associating us to our maleness and femaleness, which we do not necessarily identify with. In terms of sexual orientations, as trans persons, we are not even having that conversation at the moment. We are still finding that a space where we are discovering. And even within our own movement, that conversation is being a violent conversation. So allow us to come to you at our own terms. Do not intersect us and insert us because it is comfortable for you at this particular juncture and people are giving you money. And so economic emancipation for trans persons is not happening because cis homosexuals and cis heterosexuals are still occupying our spaces. And we cannot call this out. Then we are told we are angry.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We also had Sebenzile.
I'm not sure I want to speak on that.
It's okay. We need to close.
It's okay. It's okay if you feel like it was quite, yeah. Are we ready to close?
Yes.
All right.
I have announcements to close, then I'll make announcements.
Okay, okay. We need to maybe get your attention, please.
Order, please. Order.
Okay, we'll give Alice a chance, then we're closing after that. Time is not
It's just a comment. I've heard a few things yesterday as well as now, which have really hit one deep down in the gut. And I'm just wondering how the facilitators will choose to respond to that. You may not have an answer, but I think it's really important to affirm the fact that certain things have been said.
No.
So it's just, because all I heard was it's time to close, so maybe I misunderstood. But just to at least affirm what people have said.
Okay. No. I think I need to clarify what we were saying. So the session was supposed to end at 10:30. So basically what we were saying is we had squeezed in Sebenzile, and now that Sebenzile no longer wanted to say anything, we were thinking we had already cut off the number of people that can contribute. So what we were saying is now that Sebenzile no longer wants to, we just cut the questions and then we have closing remarks. Yes, it's not to close. We are.
No, we're not
we
shutting
are. We're
anyone
not
down.
shutting anyone down. We are going to have a conversation about this. It was just to say now that Sebenzile no longer wants to say anything, and we had already cut off the number of people that can contribute. So yeah.
Go ahead and repeat what you started with. Remember, you
Yeah.
started addressing with the one.
About? Or about the talking of people's stories.
Yeah.
Okay. So in closing, I think I need to reaffirm what I said earlier on about respecting, people's spaces and privacies as well. The fact that we are not allowed to share people's experiences or stories provided we get consent, and also just respecting personal space as well. I mean, that is very crucial because sometimes I understand sometimes you add out of goodwill, but the moment you get, called out, please step back. Because if you continue, it becomes a problem. It becomes harassment in different aspects.
Yeah, and just to highlight on that one, just to add on to what was being said about pronouns, honestly, you can't tell someone what they should be called, no matter how well-intending you are. It is not up to you to tell people how they should want
If
to
it
be
makes you
addressed.
uncomfortable, that's your story. Deal with it, but respect what the person says. If they want to be called it,
That's
irrespective of how you feel or how you were raised up, I know we have different morals, but let us not try to impose our morals on other people. So I think we need to pay attention to that. Can I get everyone's attention, please? So let's be aware of pronouns. If you're unsure, ask, and then so that you can know how to address people. So in closing, I still maintain that progressive politics are able to provide an adequate response to social change, particularly the social change that we want to see as the LGBTI community. However, our governments and also our activists need to know when it's time to sit back and allow people to actually lead the process. So if you are gay, or if let's say if you are G and you are in a policy-making environment, you need to know when it's a time for you to keep quiet and let transgender people take over the process so that they can also amplify their issues. No. Yeah. That's definitely true. That's definitely true. Don't think. Oh no, I gave you guys an opportunity now. It always happens. We are the gays. We gave you an opportunity. No, that's not how it is. People have equal rights to actually voice out their struggles. No one does anyone any favor. I think that's one thing we need to understand, because I think somehow the gays, we always have that mentality that, no, we are doing you a favor of some sort. It's not always like that. So I don't think I should say anything further because we don't have. Yeah. Sure. Can continue.
Okay.
I didn't even mean to offend anyone, by the way.
Hello, order, please. Announcements before we break for tea. Could the following please come at least 10 or 15 minutes before the session starts? Linda, Miguel, Jesse, Dr. Kabila, and Honorable Musotwani, please come early so that you get mic'd up for the next session. Our break will be about, what time is it? About 25 minutes, so that the next session will only be 5 minutes late. Our break should be about 25 minutes. Let us try to be time conscious. Let us limit our conversations, because we have a self-organizing space later. So let us take advantage of that. And again, as a reminder, we have up to the end of break time to register your self-organized spaces. We have up to break time. Beyond that, we will not be accepting any requests for self-organized spaces. It needs to be done in advance so that we organize spaces for everybody. With that said...
Can I conclude?
Yes.
Okay. By all means, it has been an absolute pleasure. And I just want to amplify voices by saying the term dumela is to say, I see you. And I don't just see your body, my soul sees the inner you. And sometimes we get so conflicted by what our eyes see and forget that underneath all this, we breathe the same. My hope is, as we leave this place at the end of this kopano, we would have seen each other and truly, truly seen each other, because only then can we feel for each other. And it is my prayer that that is where we end up, no matter how we get there, but I truly, truly hope at the end of it, we would have absolutely seen each other. Namaste.
So, break now, right?